So again, welcome everyone. Before we get started, we just need to do a quick disclaimer on the Arc of Lehigh and Northampton counties. So this webinar this morning is housing for people with disabilities. It is August 18th, 2021. Our guest presenter is Christine McIntyre, who is a staff attorney with North Penn Legal Services. We do want to note that the Arc of Lehigh and Northampton County's Advocacy Department does not employ lawyers nor provide legal advice. This training or any other provided by our department does not constitute or imply endorsement, recommendation, or favoring of the providing party or any employees or contractors acting on its behalf. This webinar is being provided for educational and informative purposes only. All right, so now it is my great pleasure to introduce Christine McIntyre. She joined North Penn Legal Services as a staff attorney in the fall of 2019, where she practices housing and Social Security law. She has a master's degree in public policy from the American University School of Public Affairs and received her law degree from Albany Law School in 2015. She served as a law clerk to the Honorable H. Matthew Curry in Warren County, New Jersey, and as an assistant prosecutor for the Hunterdon County Prosecutor's Office. During law school, Christine participated in several pro bono clinics for veterans and as an intern with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of New York. Christine is very happy to continue working in public service and advocating for those who need a voice and is excited for sharing this partnership with the Arc of Lehigh and Northampton counties. So thank you so much for coming on this morning, Christine. The Zoom is now yours.
Okay, sounds great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Just real quick, if anyone has any questions, I would just ask that they reserve it for the end of the presentation, and I will answer everyone's question to the best of my ability in a timely manner. Okay, so housing for people with disabilities. Okay, what does this mean? So we're going to go into our first slide. So what is housing? I felt like it was necessary to define it because it can mean so many different things to so many different people. Housing, can be obviously a private house. It can be public. It can be subsidized. It can be a manufactured home community, also known as a mobile home. It can be a group home, rooming house, boarding home, or a nursing home, or any kind of assisted living center, whether that be private or public. So as you can see, it's a pretty wide range of what is housing and how it can be defined, but each of those things are important, and we'll get into that as the presentation proceeds. Next slide. Okay, so disability defined. Disability defined, it can be an individual with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or an individual who is regarded as having such of an impairment, or an individual with a record of that impairment. So what do each of those things mean? Next slide. So a major life activity could be anything that, helps you get through your day. The ability to see, hear, speak, walk, breathe, care for oneself, performing manual tasks, such as, maybe cutting up vegetables or getting a glass of water, or even typing, and learning. Learning is a big one. Next slide. So before we get into the Section 504 housing, I just wanted to add some a tidbit. Actually, if you, Jessica, I apologize. Can you go back 2 slides? I was just going to further define an individual who is regarded as having such of an impairment, or an individual with a record of a past impairment. So any individual that has an impairment, who was previously known as having an impairment, or is regarded. So someone who does not have to necessarily be diagnosed with an impairment, but if they were regarded by others in their community, or people they live with, or people they go to school with as having an impairment, it still counts. So even if, there is a diagnosis that maybe that doesn't meet the exact criteria of what would be otherwise a category that that individual would fit into, can still be described and categorized as a disability. So I just wanted to clarify that. And if people have any questions about like more specific examples, we can go into that at the end of the presentation. Okay, so Jessica, 2 slides forward, please. Okay. So Section 504 housing. It is a federal type of housing that has special programs for housing for individuals with disabilities. And it provides special units equipped that have ease of access and adaptive technologies to help those with disabilities live in and enjoy their homes. It has a fixed monthly rental rate. And of course, as federal housing goes, it, there is this prohibition of discrimination against individuals with disabilities who receive federal assistance for housing that is otherwise known as the Fair Housing Act. Next slide. So 504 section housing can help a person with IDD in the following ways. Landlords and property managers cannot do any of the following things due to a person's disability, which again can be regarded as having a disability. So, for example, they're not allowed to charge excessive rent. They can't deny their tenant the ability to participate in certain programs because of a disability or a perceived disability. A landlord cannot require participation in separate programs and services from those available to persons without disabilities. They cannot refuse to rent or sell property to a person with a disability. They cannot force their tenants to live on certain floors or certain areas. So segregation, for example, they can't segregate the tenants with disabilities versus those without disabilities. They cannot refuse to make repairs. They cannot deny people with disabilities access to recreational and common area facilities, like a pool or a gym, parking, or janitorial services. And finally, they can't prevent persons from disabilities from serving on planning or advisory boards. So this is important because the whole goal of the Fair Housing Act is to ensure fair housing, but also fair access and fair representation in all areas of life, right? So that is the main point of why I'm making this slide and why I'm discussing this. The point is that persons with disabilities deserve and are entitled to the ability to participate or not participate in any aspect of housing life that any other person would otherwise be entitled to. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So there are additional protections, like I said, for people with disabilities. The Fair Housing Act is one, which is a federal law. But there are also those, and I'm going to move my little thing over here. There's also local ordinances and state ordinances. So for those who have disabilities and who are in an additional protected class, whether it be age, race, national origin, etc., the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act makes it illegal to discriminate, for example, in a housing-related transaction on the basis of age, unless the property owner has like a very small building, like a duplex, where that owner actually also resides. So like there are some exceptions that people can be made aware of, but for the most part, any kind of Fair Housing Act or discrimination ordinances apply to property management companies on like a larger scale, and even some landlords who might be like a mom and pop type shop. but they happen to have more than one unit or a unit where they don't actually live. So it still counts. Allentown, Bethlehem, and Easton ordinances also have this protect against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, as well as marital status. So in addition to, all these other prohibitions, age, disability, and the like, more towns and cities are also recognizing, as they should, protections for people on the basis of sex and gender identity, and expression. Next slide, please. Okay, so first steps. How do I know what to do first if I want to move out, or I want to live on my own, or I want to get a roommate? Basically something that involves not living with mom and dad, right? So you would start with a plan. Having some savings is always a good idea. Most properties, as you may know, require a security deposit up front. Now, federal subsidized buildings still require a security. It's going to be calculated based on income. So that is something that each housing authority would determine once that person is approved and deemed eligible. So again, it depends on, that person's income and resources, but a lot of security deposits in private units technically require more. So that would be 1 month's rent and 1 month's security. So basically 2 months of rent, and it must be paid at the time of move-in, or, as you're submitting your final paperwork to get moved in. So just be aware of that, because it's really important to know. And, you're going to start with an apartment search, and you would ask questions like, well, where do I want to live? And does this apartment fit my budget? Is this apartment, well situated to maybe some programs or some community resources that I want to take advantage of? If I live here, would I need to have a car? Just things like that to just be aware of, which, I'm putting in here just because there are some questions that anybody who's never maybe searched for an apartment before could think of and just start to think of. And then finally, filling out applications. They're usually done online. You can ask a parent or a friend to help. The only problem with a lot of these is they can get costly, right? Some applications are anywhere from $25 to $45 each application. Sometimes they can be waived. In Section 504 housing in particular, and federal housing, they don't charge you to apply because it's subsidized housing. But in the realm of private apartment complexes, they can charge a rate that the company agrees to. So it is something to be aware of, especially now if you are more aggressively looking for an apartment, just to be prepared, you could spend probably a few $100s easily trying to fill out applications alone. So it is something to consider. Next slide. Okay. So just gonna flip to my handout. I have a physical handout here, which I thought, would be easy for me to see. So for rights for people with disabilities for equal enjoyment of the property. So I had mentioned something a few slides back about how people with disabilities, just like anyone, have a right to, peaceful enjoyment of the premises, which is a legal term, but there's also, the access component that I had, talked about and touched on. So equal enjoyment for a person with disabilities can happen with two different types of requests, one of which is a reasonable modification, and the other is a reasonable accommodation. Now, these types of requests are things that were legislated through the Fair Housing Act. and it entitles a person with disabilities to make a special request to either have their current unit modified in some way or another to ensure better access. So it could be in the form of requesting a structural change to the inside of an apartment or a common area. And if it's federal housing, it's actually paid for by federal money because this is protected under law. A reasonable accommodation, on the other hand, could be any change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, practice, or service. So it is slightly different from a modification, and we'll get into some examples in a minute. But a reasonable accommodation can be requested at any time unless it causes an undue hardship on the housing provider or landlord. And an undue hardship could mean, especially if it's so costly that it would be basically impossible for the landlord or property management company from undertaking it without having, some kind of financial impediment to the company. Next slide. Okay, so a reasonable modification example. So modification to a unit would be some examples: installing a ramp or a stair glide for somebody with a mobility issue, installing a peephole in a door for someone with a hearing disability, installing a timer to a water faucet with someone with memory issues, or providing additional fire and other safety inspection checks for someone with a mental health disorder. Next slide. Some examples for reasonable accommodation. An individual on a third floor is allowed to move to a first floor due to mobility issues, especially if there is no elevator in the building. An individual with sensitivities to certain chemicals and smells is notified in advance of painting and exterminations and other things like that. Other examples of a reasonable accommodation include that an individual is allowed to transfer to a different unit away from loud noises if that person has like a sensory perception issue, or someone that has hearing issues that, loud noises such that would amplify the effect of that person's disability. And then finally, someone who would use a wheelchair that would require a reserved parking space near the ramp. Like, that's an easy fix. Next slide. So how do I ask for a reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification? Well, it's pretty easy. All you would have to do is make the request in writing to your landlord or housing provider or property manager, anybody basically that you see on a regular basis. And it can be in an email, a letter, or a text message. The request must directly relate to the disability. And this is bolded because this is the important part of it. You do not have to tell anyone what your disability is. All you have to do is explain why you otherwise can't enjoy the property and why, it is, causing problems. You should receive a response within 2 weeks. If it takes any longer, my office would view it as a denial, for example, but they must respond. So if you don't get a response at all, that's a big no-no. The property management company cannot ask what your disability is, but can ask your medical provider to confirm that you have a disability, unless it is obvious or you have a clear reason for seeking a request. So a clear reason would be someone with a wheelchair needs a ramp or a parking spot, close to the entrance. That would be a clear reason or an obvious reason. If there's a disability that someone cannot see, for example, that is not obvious, a medical provider can write a letter And all they have to do is just say that, I am writing on behalf of my patient who has a disability and is requesting this specific thing due to that person's disability. And, they don't have to go into detail, like I said, because that would be a HIPAA violation. They don't have to, explain the nitty gritty of why you would need such a request. All they have to do is just say that, you need this. All right. Okay. Next slide. So I wanted to touch briefly on something that is also covered by the Fair Housing Act and actually the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, service animals and emotional support animals. So landlords, there's common situations out there where landlords try to say, oh, my tenant has, this dog, and they're trying to say that it's a service dog, but I don't think it's a service dog. I think it's a pet. They are not pets. Okay. Just want to clarify that. A person with a disability may request a reasonable accommodation for a service animal if the person can show the relationship between needing the animal and the disability. Okay, so again, this can be something that could be solved with a letter from your doctor to the property management company. There are so many examples of why an emotional support animal or a service animal would be needed. They serve so many different purposes that I don't have enough knowledge to obviously talk about, but they serve a wide range of mental health disorders. So for individuals, for example, with anxiety, severe social anxiety, crippling anxiety, an emotional support animal is there for that person. So like I said, the possibilities are really endless for the need of an animal. So for a property management company to demand, a pet deposit or pet rent for a service animal, that is also a big no-no. They are not allowed to do so. And if there is, ever a problem like that, you always have a right to question why they're charging something when this is a situation that would be protected by law. Okay. And even, I just wanted to add this last bit, even larger breed dogs or dogs typically banned in many housing communities, such as pit bulls, Rottweilers, and other such dogs can be allowed as service animals. So, you might have seen things in the news about certain companies trying to ban certain types of animals from being service animals. Well, the perspective is very broad. So, just keep that in mind for the future. Next slide. Okay, so types of public housing options. There are general public housing complexes that are usually in a larger housing complex where the housing authority offices are located. So, for example, the Lehigh County Housing Authority in Emmaus, and we'll get into all this. They have a big housing location where they have a very large housing complex where the offices are located in the basement or the first floor. There's also property-based vouchers. There are tenant-based vouchers, which are known as Section 8 or housing choice vouchers, which are the most common type of voucher that most people are familiar with. BMIR is the base market rate of an area where a unit was located, and it's actually now becoming more of a defunct category, but it was something that was popular 30, 40 years ago when it was based on trying to make affordable housing for individuals, most in particular families, for homes that would otherwise be priced out of the market. And then finally, there is Section 202, which is housing units for senior citizens, which can also tie into individuals with disabilities. So next slide. Okay, so public housing. What's the point? Public housing is established to provide decent and safe rental housing for eligible low-income families, the elderly, and persons with disabilities. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, administers federal aid to local housing authorities, which are called HAs for short, that manage the housing for low-income residents at rents they can afford. Next slide. Subsidized housing, on the other hand, is a small component of public housing where it represents many different types of programs also administered through HUD that depend on state and local financial resources. So like I said, the Section 8 vouchers are under that category of subsidized housing. And again, the point is to provide safe, decent, and affordable housing for low to moderate income individuals, families, senior citizens, and individuals with disabilities. And again, the eligibility is based on income and other property requirements. So I just want to say real quick, the difference between a Section 8 voucher and public housing. Public housing, your options are far more limited in terms of where you want to live, because the properties that are located that have public housing are basically limited. I mean, there's a few across the Lehigh Valley, and that's where you would go. Section 8 vouchers, on the other hand, are vouchers. It's subsidized housing based on your income, whereby you would pay a portion of your income to the landlord, who is typically a private landlord, and you can live in a house or apartment. It depends. It's a wide range, but you would have to find a landlord that would be willing to accept your voucher, which again is issued through the housing authority, but it just gives you a little bit more options compared to a public housing authority complex. Okay, next slide. Funding for public housing. Okay, so there are some federal programs through HUD that I had mentioned, and there are also some state programs through the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services that they manage through these local public housing authorities. And like Lehigh County Housing Authority is one of them, so is Allentown Housing Authority, and the City of Easton Housing Authority. So like I said, they get their funding mostly from the federal government, but it trickles down through the states. And then the states, in turn, funnel some of that money locally. Okay, next slide. So how do I know if I'm eligible for public housing? So it's, like I said, typically determined by the individual public housing authority, based on total annual gross income and family size, and is limited to US citizens and permanent residents. So in general, the family's income may not exceed 50% of the median income for the county or the area in which the family chooses to live. And this number I based on the previous presentation I gave to you guys. Back in 2020, the median income for Lehigh County and Northampton counties was $78,200 for, I believe, a family of 4. So the threshold is $39,100 a year. And I'm sure that number has changed. And again, there's so many different ways to calculate income, and each housing authority has their own calculus for why they determine eligibility. So that is something that you would have to check out with each individual housing authority. A PHA, as they're called, Public Housing Authority, must provide 75% of its vouchers to applicants whose income do not exceed 30% of the area median income. So this number last year at least was $26,000. Median income levels are published by HUD and vary by location. And if you are deemed eligible, then you're placed on a wait list, which I'm starting to see through the chat box that somebody was referencing a wait list. This wait list can be quite long, and it can be anywhere from a few months to a few years, which is not great, but it gives you time to prepare for being ready for it, because there is, at least with respect to public housing in the large complexes, they do inspections. So you would have to, be prepared for that whole process. And again, that's something that the individual public housing authority would tell you, like what the steps are involved after you've been approved. Next slide. So how does the application work? Contact your local housing authority, and I will have numbers for you guys if you don't already have them. The housing authority rep can also fill out a paper application, but the application generally contains names of all the people who would be living in your household, your present address and telephone number, family characteristics or circumstances that might qualify you for certain tenant selection preferences. And again, that can be a range of requests. An estimate of your anticipated income over the next year and sources of that income, names and addresses of employers, banks, and other information that the housing authority would need to verify income and family composition, and a possible home visit for an interview. Next slide. Okay, so here is a list of local housing authorities and their location and phone numbers. So how do I get on the wait list for public housing? You would visit the specific public housing authority website and apply online, or call the number. Housing authorities are required to publish the opening and closing of various wait lists. I am not sure how they publish this, because I don't think it's available through their website. They would have to give you a specific link. If you're on the wait list itself, you would already have access to that information. However, I need to make you guys aware that they are not going to give you an estimate of how long they expect it to take for you to move up on the list. Usually they can tell you where you are on the list, but they can't tell you how long it will take, or, like I said, when they expect you to move up, because it's such a really hard thing to determine. Because it depends on, lots of different situations for each individual family or person who's already on the list above you. You can sign up to get email alerts at www.affordableHousingOnline.com, but there is that wait list, and it's definitely been exacerbated by COVID. So the sooner you can get on a wait list, the better. And, there is no rule that says you can't be on multiple wait lists. You can, especially if you are being, flexible to moving if you were chosen. So that is something to consider. Next slide. So what are some obligations and responsibilities as a tenant if you have public housing or if you have a voucher? Well, there's a few things. So each head of household in a subsidized housing unit, sorry, ruffling of papers, must recertify their annual income with their respective housing authority every year. You also have other obligations that could be determined by your HAP contract, which is a housing authority program contract. So while you have a lease with your housing authority, if you have Section 8, for example, you would have the housing authority lease, and then you would have a lease between the private landlord as well. Okay. So anytime there's a change to income, whether it's through employment or loss of employment or a change in public benefits, the household must report those changes to the housing authority so that their monthly rental obligation can either be increased or reduced depending on what the family or the person can pay. So that's very important that you have to keep them aware of any changes going on in your household that would affect what your monthly rent is or your monthly subsidy. Okay. So compliance with the rules under a HAP contract. Like I said, there's special notice requirements and protections for tenants, but as a tenant, you also have an obligation to keep your unit free from criminal activity, property damage, and this really applies to any landlord-tenant situation out there. Don't damage the property, don't harass your neighbors. Keep things clean and orderly, pay your rent. And I believe all this is on the next few slides down. So if we want to go to the next slide, a bit more about Section 8 vouchers. These types of vouchers enable individuals with low income to rent from a participating landlord in the community. The participant pays up to 30% of their income for rent and utilities, whereas public housing, the calculus is a lot lower. And the program in that case would pay the rest. So for example, say you had $300 in partial SSI benefits, and that was all your income. That was what you received per month. And your rent was $1,000 a month. And again, it's going to depend on the calculus, but your obligation for that $1,000 would be $100 because it would be 30% of your income. So just to give you an idea, so it would be, 1/3 of what you're bringing in, and then the program would pay the rest. And again, that's just an example. Obviously, the math is different for every person and every household. And there are many different types of voucher programs. Like I said, there are project-based vouchers where there are landlords that are allowed to rehab old properties. So that property has the voucher, not the tenant. So whoever decides to come and go, they have that voucher. So if they're living there, they have the voucher for that time being. If they move out, the voucher stays with the property. So the individual is then responsible for trying to seek out a different voucher. Tenant-based vouchers are the most common. They enable low-income individuals to rent private housing they otherwise couldn't afford without financial assistance. And obviously, the price of housing in the Lehigh Valley, as well as most of America right now, is obscene. I'm not going to lie, it's crazy. And even with the current political climate, with an increase in food stamps and all that, like it's still becoming virtually impossible for anyone on a fixed income to find housing now. And that's something, that hopefully will change. Hopefully more properties will get built. So we'll see. Time will tell. Mainstream vouchers are vouchers for individuals with disabilities. So again, that's a different type of voucher. And then there's vouchers for persons with disabilities, which is for very low income within individuals with disabilities. So for an individual who receives SSI, but it's so low income because the person, for whatever reason, doesn't have like a work history or doesn't have a lot of resources, that is something else to consider. And then finally, there is this program called Shelter Care Plus that I wanted to throw in, which is a sub-program within Section 8 for individuals with mental illness and mental health disorders. Eligibility is upon recommendation from a case manager, where again, the participant pays 30% of their income towards rent and utilities, and the program pays the rest. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about this previously. A general individual's responsibilities to be a good tenant. Keep a copy of your lease. Number one, first and foremost, if you don't have a copy of your lease when you move in, you have a right to request for one. If the landlord gives you a hard time, make sure that you keep requesting it, because you are entitled to that. Oral leases in the state of Pennsylvania are legal up until 3 years. However, most tenant-based vouchers and public housing require a written lease, so the landlord has to provide it. Any other important paperwork, make sure you keep it in a special folder. Just to have, make sure any copies of anything you give the housing authority, you have your own copy. Always make sure you have your own copy. Documents tend to get lost sometimes, and you would otherwise not have proof that you gave it to them. A copy of the document that you have is your proof that they had it, or that you can readily provide it to them to help yourself, if there's like a lack of documentation, for example, or something like that. So always pay your rent every month. If it's part of your obligation, pay it on time. So if it's due the first of the month, make sure you pay it on the first of the month. If it's due on the third Monday of the month to correspond with when you get your benefits, make sure you pay it then. Always keep receipts. And the same goes for utility bills. Always make sure, if that's your responsibility, to keep copies of the receipts and everything you pay. If you need a repair, you have to tell your landlord in writing. Okay, it has to be via an email or a letter or a text message, but it has to be in writing, because it has to be documented each time that you've requested a repair, so that if the landlord fails to make those repairs, you have a record. Okay. Same goes for neighbors. If you're having a neighbor who is unreasonably bothering you, somebody who maybe like knocks on your door 5 times a day just for fun, and runs away, things like that. Someone who blasts music at all hours, things like that. Again, tell your landlord in writing, text message, email, so that there is a record. If you call your landlord on the phone and complain about it, there's no record. So if it becomes an issue down the road, you have no proof that you made that phone call. Okay. Make sure your home is well maintained. Keep it clean, free of hazards and clutter. So this is something that is actually the tenant responsibility, but could be made as a reasonable accommodation request if needed, changing the light bulbs and the batteries in the smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. Some individuals need assistance with that, and that's okay. So just make sure to ask. Doesn't hurt to ask in writing. So don't do anything that violates your lease agreement. Inviting someone to come live with you without asking your landlord's permission. Doing anything to interfere with your neighbors' peaceful enjoyment of the premises. So if you're the one knocking on your neighbor's door just for fun and running away, that would be not a good thing to do. Harassing or fighting with your neighbors, making excessive noise, creating excessive odors, things like that. Anything that would be a nuisance, just be aware of it. Next slide. Okay, so part of this presentation is about benefit impact. The benefit to having public housing outweighs what we as advocates believe is better than the alternatives. So benefit impact, it allows people with disabilities to live independently, engage in the community, and live within their budget and their financial means. So they have that sense of independence, but they can afford it. So that is the goal with public housing and subsidized housing for individuals with disabilities. Next slide. So I added a couple slides here that I wanted to talk about more about the benefit impact. So receiving SSI or SSDI benefits can be relief to many, but it's also a burden, right? So why do I say that? Well, it impacts your ability to find affordable housing in the community because you're on a fixed income and because there's these long wait lists. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities face a housing crisis right now with many contributing factors. Like I said, there's a lack of this safe, affordable, and integrated housing and significant housing-related discrimination. And since COVID, the wait lists for affordable housing have gotten even longer. There are a lot of Section 8 tenants or Section 8 landlords, who are getting out of the market. They are selling their properties. They are no longer accepting vouchers. It is making things, even more dire. In addition, Medicaid, which is also called medical assistance in Pennsylvania, typically does not allow those funds to be used towards rent or other community-based housing costs. But there is a silver lining. A consolidated waiver allows two services not covered by the PF waiver, which someone had referenced in their questions to me, which I'll be happy to answer at the end. They do cover licensed residential habilitation as well as unlicensed residential habilitation. So next slide. Okay, so the types of waivers, which if this audience is well aware of this, I'm just going to gloss over. But there are the consolidated waivers, which are the big waivers, which typically cover that licensed and unlicensed residential habilitation. And then there's the person family directed support waivers, which are smaller waivers that cover up to $30,000 a year per person for other things. And I think I wrote in residential care, and I just want to make sure, yeah, it does not cover residential care. So if you have a PF waiver, just be aware of that. It doesn't cover residential care. But both waivers typically cover, other services like assistive technology and benefits counseling, companionship, education, employment supports, family and caregiver training, respite care, supported living, therapy, transportation, all that. Both waivers are subjected, obviously, to limited capacity and funding. So the sooner you make a phone call about this, the better. Both also require a diagnosis of a disability, a need for the same level of care provided in a care facility for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, active treatment. There's a need for the active treatment, I'm sorry, and then meet income and resource requirements. Next slide. So there's additional resources out there specifically for disability related services that I wanted to include on this slide. There's a couple here that I thought were important. Intellectual Disabilities and Autism Services, which is administered through the Office of Developmental Programs, and I have their number. The Options Programs or program for people with IDD who are over 60 years of age, and that's actually administered through the PA Department of Aging. Medicaid and community-based services, waiver programs for Pennsylvanians over the age of 18, as well as older adults through the Office of Long-Term Living waiver programs. So that's something that, I would highly recommend checking out. There is also a couple different other entities that I wanted to list. The Self-Determination Housing Project of Pennsylvania, which is a big proponent of integrated services for individuals who want to live independently in the community. So again, I would highly recommend checking out that agency. They're wonderful people. Compass, they administer medical assistance, SNAP, which is food benefits, LIHEAP, which is the low income housing, or I'm sorry, low income heat and electrical and other utility program that gets you affordable utility bills. And then home and community-based services are also administered through Compass, but you would have to, call to check out exactly which ones. And then finally, the Bureau of Autism Services, which is administered through the Pennsylvania Department of Health or Department of Human Services. Next slide. Here's some other general resources that I wanted to list. If you are interested in applying for SSI or SSDI, you would go on ssa.gov. National Center on Law and Elder Rights has information on ABLE accounts and disability advocacy, as well as ablenrc.org. HUD is the big umbrella agency that administers all these public and subsidized housing programs. And then another good one I thought to mention was pahousingsearch.com, which has free housing searches for Pennsylvanians. And then carelink.pa.gov for aging and disability resources. And then the Center for Independent Living is also a fantastic organization. A plug for Debbie Razier, who is awesome over there. And she's, she believes in what she does. And I do think that they are also yet another wonderful resource for individuals who are looking to have integrated, services and independence in the community. And then finally, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation is, information on my agency, North Penn Legal Services. That is our main number, or you can apply online at northpennlegal.org. And we actually just changed our website. But if you type in northpennlegal.org, it'll actually lead you to the website, which is now known as nplspa.org.
Great, thank you so much.